Well, my editing skills are crap, but can the same thing be said about King Arthur, Legend of the Sword? Stick around and find out. Brum 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 brum. That's supposed to be God Save the Queen, not My Country 'Tis of Thee. Because this is a British movie. It's British, with British lore, and British people making it, British people acting in it. But it doesn't feel like I would have expected. If you would have told me, yes, this is going to be an Arthurian legend story, and all these British people are going to make it, and it's going to be super legit. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. Hi, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com. This is my uncut review of King Arthur, Legend of the Sword. All right, the synopsis on IMDb reads, robbed of his birthright, Arthur comes up the hard way in the back alleys of the city. But once he pulls the sword from the stone, he is forced to acknowledge his true legacy, whether he likes it or not. All right, so normally I would not be into like Arthurian legend and Camelot stuff and Avalon and whatever else the crap, you know. Typically when I see like versions of those stories brought to life in movies and TV and stuff, they feel a little dry and bland to me. This is anything but that. This is chock full of flavor, and totally the flavor that I like. I imagine that people that are big fans of like Arthurian legend and stuff, that they might just be offended by what they're doing stylistically with this. Like, oh, this should be much more bland. I don't know. But it's a very different feel and tone from anything I've seen done before that has to do with this kind of lore. It's a dark sword and sorcery fantasy flick. Awesome! There are so few of those, and they tend not to do well in the box office and then result in sequels and stuff like that. They tend to be smaller movies. I think of the recent attempt at a Conan reboot. I think of the Solomon Kane movie, which even had trouble getting distribution in the United States. So these movies do not tend to be these big blockbusters. And yet we have this one here that has some very recognizable faces, and Guy Ritchie is the director on this, and you can definitely tell that it's got Guy Ritchie's kind of style attached to it. There's lots of kind of like quick cuts and editing gags and stuff like that. I mean, they're definitely having fun with it in the way that Guy Ritchie, I've seen him do in other movies that he's made. But that said, this is a flick that takes threats, takes evil seriously, and gives evil and gives threats great weight and consequence. Evil does bad things in this movie. And yet the movie also uses humor now and then to maybe as an attempt to counterbalance that. But the humor doesn't come in the midst of these bad things happening. Those moments are allowed to have their weight, to have their impact on me as a viewer, and then the lighter scenes, they tend to be kind of separated, and where they're doing kind of like the editing gags and being clever and stuff like that. That tends to happen in other scenes where the good guys are talking to each other or making their plans of how they're going to kick butt or whatever, you know. And I think I prefer that rather than the jokes being inserted into the middle of these really intense moments. I'd rather let those intense moments be intense and let me feel the weight of that. So it felt like they were changing the mood in the way they used humor rather than kind of breaking the mood for me by injecting it into an intense scene. That said, I still didn't laugh at the jokes, but I mean, I'm no indicator of what people will find funny, because I think a lot of people find movies funny that I just don't find funny, and so I don't want to say that this was like really a surprisingly satisfying movie with comedic elements that even I liked. So it wasn't that, but at least they weren't an interruption for me, and in fact, they most of the time felt like a natural outworking of the character rather than just kind of like some jokes that were thrown in just to lighten up the mood artificially. largely, the dialogue in the script has a more formalized or timeless feel, which you would expect, with something with this kind of setting. But there are a few exceptions that sound a little bit modern, and they don't go as classically sounding, certainly, as they could. And there's also the editing and just kind of the general attitude of the movie, the characters, just kind of the vibe. It has kind of a modern, somewhat rebellious or subversive kind of vibe to it, but in kind of a fun way, I think, or in a cool way. Kind of like maybe the movie 300 subverts your expectations of a sword and sandals flick by putting in these modern stylized things in the way they shoot the action, in the soundtrack choices and stuff like that. I'll get to the music in a second, though. The non-linear editing that they would use every now and then, it kept what is, to me, a fairly standard story that we have here, interesting and my brain active, because I'd be like, oh, they would do an editing thing like, oh, is this how they're imagining things will go as they're talking about how they're planning things? Or is this actually flashing forward to how things did go and will go and stuff like that? And so there's just little like things that they do with editing that make you wonder, okay, what are they telling me is actually happening in the story or will happen? And so it kept it interesting and kept me on a scene by scene basis kind of guessing at where they were going to be going in the next moments of the movie. And so I appreciated that. It's only about 2 hours long, a little over, but a lot happens in this movie, and that's achieved in part because the editing and the visual or nonverbal storytelling. You'll see at the beginning of the movie, you see Arthur's childhood represented in a series of like quick cuts and jumping around and stuff, and it really covers that period and gives you an early sense already of who he is as a character and what he cares about and what kinds of things shaped him, representing a long period of his life in a very short period of time. And then later in the movie, there's kind of like I almost want to say like a training type of adventure that he goes on, where a lot of stuff happens. He fights and interacts and is in danger from all these different kinds of creatures, that you would not find in my experience with Arthurian type stories. But they just inject them in there and like, this is crazy cool. Look at all these crazy monsters he's fighting stuff, and so much of that happened in such a short period of time because of the way they told the story non-verbally through edits and representing the passage of time and different events through a series of short edited moments. Let's see here, what else? There were only a couple instances in the movie where I checked out, and for me that is a bummer. I was like, okay, I'm kind of losing interest here. I think maybe I wasn't as invested in the characters as I would ideally like to be. So I mean, I think that was part of the problem for me there. But also sometimes there would just be like, my mind would wander because they just did something visually interesting, or they implied something that made me wondering, okay, what's going to happen, and my mind would kind of wander in that direction. But still, I think I could take some points off if I were doing scores anymore, for them kind of allowing my mind to wander in that way. Let's see here. Okay, as far as the cast goes, it's a solid cast. It's some familiar faces and a few familiar names. The leads are doing what the script requires, and it doesn't require like these big Oscar-worthy type performances, but I do want to say that Jude Law stands out to me. He plays the super evil, yet still very human kind of villainous king that Arthur is aiming to rise up against. And they could have gone with him just being this total black hat and unrelatable, and yet they bring humanity to his choices. It doesn't excuse any of what he does, but it's right in the mix there. The fact that he loves these people, that he has love for people, and yet he's willing to do these horrible things. That's one thing that wasn't in my initial notes that I want to mention, is that magic, and when people have power of any kind, whether it's Arthur doing stuff with the sword or whether it's the evil king who is also a sorcerer, magic power, it all has a heavy cost, and it's one that is paid not just physically, but I want to say primarily emotionally. It is just agonizing. There's things that Arthur does not want to face about his past that are emotionally difficult for him, that he has to face in order to come into his true rightful power. And there are some horrible twisted things that that the evil sorcerer king has to do in order to take advantage of his full power. And so I love that. I love when because it sets limits and there's a cost for the characters being able to do all these spectacular things. If they can just always do these spectacular things all the time, then I don't have a sense of the limits, and I'm just like, well, anything could happen, you know. But in this one, there's a clear cost associated with power, and so that helps me just kind of stay engaged with the story and the way powers are used. As far as like stunts and visuals, there's lots of CG eye candy of varying qualities in this movie. Lots of CG creatures and monsters, which again I would not have expected in something based on Arthurian legend. There's lots of magic effects and and digital cinematography. They use when I say digital cinematography, I'm talking about stuff like you would see in The Matrix Reloaded, you know, where it's like they throw out using multiple cameras to achieve the bullet time effect, and instead they go with just a complete digital recreation of the action. And what they do in one of the pivotal combat sequences is definitely this kind of neo-Matrixy kind of thing, not in the slowed down sense, except in a few moments here and there, mostly in just that camera spinning around the action like it's a rocket, you know, like it's on a rocket. And they achieve that through a combination of like quick connection to actual filmed footage and then transitioning quickly away to CG stuff. But the way they do it, they'll have like the action blocking the face of the protagonist in some key moments to really play down the weaknesses of that kind of visual effects. And I really appreciate that, because it's usually when I see a human character's face in motion or doing or expressing itself or something that it's just like glaringly obvious that it's CG. So I appreciated them making the effort and recognizing, okay, these are the strengths of CG in action, in recreating action. These are the weaknesses. Let's play up the strength, downplay the weaknesses. So I could still tell that there was CGI going on, but it was downplayed enough that I really appreciate it. And I was able to, I think, enjoy the action more. I think I'll certainly enjoy it more on a second viewing, because now I've watched it once. I know I paid attention, you know, to how they did the tricks, and now I can just sit back and enjoy it the next time. So anyway, the magic as it's used in the movie and represented visually, it ranges from kind of visually grounded, you know, just doing simple things, or more like subtle things like taking control of animals and changing their behavior, all the way up to massive and spectacular things like these waves of force that radiate outward and just consume people or cause things to go flying everywhere, you know. And yet still in all of that big spectacle, there are grim and muted colors that are fitting for dark fantasy. And if you haven't figured out by now, I tend to like stuff that's heavy, that's serious, that's dark, and that's grim, you know. Oddly enough, that kind of stuff can even make me smile. I don't know what's wrong with me. Anyway, on to music and sound. I don't always comment on this, but I want to comment on the music. The soundtrack is kind of this modern slash electronic slash orchestral mix. Not to the point of like, say, Lady Hawk, where it's like it's rock all the way through, you know, pretty much. I think that's what I haven't been able to watch that movie since, because the music dates it so much. And that's what I wonder about this movie, is like, will the music date this movie in the same way that Lady Hawk is dated by its music? I don't think so, because I think it's a little bit more of a blend of kind of like what you would expect in an orchestral scoring for a movie like this, and some modern sounds and modern electronic sounds, or sometimes just modern, you know, electronic production mixing, you know, as opposed to out and out using synths and, you know, electronic instrumentation. It does some of that, but anyway, I'm just curious how it will age, but it does fit, I think, the movie's blend of classic fantasy and this kind of subversive, almost, you know, heavy metal kind of attitude to the visual representation of the world. All right, so I always try to ask myself when I take in entertainment, is there anything of worthwhile philosophical, moral, or spiritual significance being stated here, or that could be illustrated by this movie that might trigger worthwhile thought or conversation? I don't know. I'd be curious what the filmmaker might be intending in that regard, because nothing stood out to me as really being intended as like a message or anything like that. I think it largely is, you know, what it is. It's like this dark fantasy sword and sorcery adventure movie. But some stuff that stood out to me, I think in particular, just for whatever reason, The first would be that the villain. I was thinking about how I can relate to the villain, and a lot of times, we'll think about how we can relate to the hero in a movie like this. But and I think probably, if anything, the hero is intended to be the one that we relate to. But for whatever weird reason, I connected with the villain. In this one scene, he said, "To be feared." I'm misquoting here, but it was something like this. To be feared is the most exquisite sensation a man can feel. And that's really what drives him. He seeks to control an entire nation in order to gain and then maintain that feeling. And we might say, okay, well, how can I don't relate to that. I'm not interested in having power over others. And well, let's dial that back, because, in movies like this, they'll use these extreme versions of things that actually we can relate to if we dial all the elements down to a more relatable version. And when you dial down commanding fear over people and being feared by people, I think that dials down to something akin to respect. Being respected or being honored by other people around us. And I think we all kind of naturally feel that desire to be respected and honored. And I don't think it is wrong to be honored and to be respected by others. I think that's a good thing for others to do for us. I do think that there's a problem when we start feeling entitled to a certain degree of respect or honor. I think we're walking on really dangerous ground there. Because if we want that, we feel entitled to that, then we can end up actually pursuing that in subtle ways that we may not even recognize at first, that end up mistreating others or offending others because we're trying to attain and hold on to their respect or their admiration or their compliments or whatever. So the Bible teaches that humility actually, and a lack of focus on ourselves and what we feel entitled to, that is the path that results in honor, and that regardless also of the fleeting and finicky evaluations of others, our lives are worth, the worth of our lives comes from the fact that the God of the universe loves us enough that he became like one of us and died a horrible death on our behalf. That's where our value and our significance comes from. Another thing that I noticed is that Arthur tells the villain near the end of the movie, "You created me, and for that I bless you. You make sense of the devil." I know out of context that probably sounds like a really weird quote. But anyway, maybe when you see the movie, you'll see how it fits in the context. But it seems to be in that moment commenting on how good can come out of the evil actions of others. And that's a real truth. God brings about circumstances so that the free evil choices of other people he can then use to bring about something that is of great good. But I think that it's really God that we should be blessing. If we're going to bless anyone for evil that's come about, we should be blessing God, not in some ironic way blessing the person who actually chose to do evil. That's on them. They weren't trying to do anything good, so I don't think that there's really a reason we should bless them. I think we should bless the God who is capable of taking that evil and using it to bring about something good and beautiful. So anyway, I have no idea what your tastes are in movies. Clearly, I see that more and more every time I watch a Marvel movie, that I just cannot anticipate what other people will like and what they won't like. But if I were a time traveler, I'd go back in time and say, Peter, freaking insta-buy, dude. You're going to have some problems with it. You'd like to be more emotionally invested. You'd like to not check out with your brain for a couple scenes in there. But this is otherwise totally your cup of tea, and furthermore, there's a good amount of things that you can totally forgive and you won't even think about, because it's a high production value dark fantasy sword and sorcery movie that takes itself seriously and is made well. It's oh man, it's also fairly character driven, even though again it doesn't go maybe as heavy as you'd like in that department. Aesthetically dark as all get out for a PG-13 movie. It's surprising how dark this thing feels and looks for a PG-13 movie. And again, it's dark fantasy. Eat this up. It's a rare treasure. These kinds of movies typically don't do well or get sequels, so you don't even need to see it in theaters. You'll be fine. but freaking Instabuy, you're gonna really enjoy watching this at home. It's rated PG-13 for sequences of violence and action, some suggestive content, and brief, strong language. All right, those are my thoughts. I'd love to get yours in the comments below. If you want to like, share, and subscribe, then that'd be great. I appreciate that. And then also visit spiritblade.com. We got a bunch of stuff for you there. We got a weekly podcast. We're continuing to go through the book of Ephesians in the Spirit Blade Underground podcast and talking about some stuff that's related to some of the thoughts that popped to mind about our sense of worth and how we ought to view ourselves and how we can be free of some of those desires for respect that can just weigh us down and screw up our relationships and stuff like that. So there's some stuff there that's totally intended to be of benefit to you that I hope you'll check out at spiritblade.com. There's also a ton more content and community over at christiangeekcentral.com. I hope you'll join us there soon. Oh yeah, here's my sign I was supposed to put up. As we continue to geek out and seek the truth.